The headlines ignited a firestorm. At the center of this escalating conflict is nickel, the humble metal that powers the Green Revolution. For decades, it flowed seamlessly across the world's longest undefended border, a symbol of an unbreakable alliance forged in shared industry and geography. Now, that flow has been weaponized. This is no longer a simple trade dispute. It's economic brinkmanship that threatens to shatter a century of partnership, from the deepest mines Ontario to the sprawling gigafactories of the American Midwest. What happens when the unbreakable supply chain finally snaps? For over a century, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada was the global gold standard for partnership. It was more than just trade. It was a deeply integrated industrial ecosystem built on shared geography and mutual trust. Nowhere was this clearer than in the flow of raw materials. The 1965 Auto Pact had created a single continental market for vehicles and parts, turning the Great Lakes region into the world's automotive heartland. And the lifeblood of this industrial machine, particularly the resilient steel and components it required, often started as nickel ore dug from the Canadian Shield. But in the 21st century, the ground began to shift. The global race to dominate the electric vehicle market transformed nickel from a mere industrial commodity into a strategic asset of immense geopolitical importance. It became the new oil. This technological revolution collided with a powerful political one, a rising tide of economic nationalism in the United States. The old logic of continental integration began to fray. Under the banner of America First, supply chains were no longer viewed through the lens of efficiency, but through the lens of national security and vulnerability. The steel and aluminum tariffs of the previous decade were the first major shock, demonstrating that even Canada, the closest of allies, was not immune. The once unquestioned reliability of Canadian resources was suddenly being debated in Washington as a potential dependency to be managed, not a partnership to be celebrated. The symbiotic relationship was starting to feel transactional, and in Ottawa, the whispers about needing a Plan B grew louder. The foundation was cracking. The move from Washington was as blunt as it was disruptive. Framed as a decisive strike in the global economic war with China, the White House announced a sweeping new tariff on electric vehicles and their core components. The stated goal was twofold: to protect the nascent American EV industry from a flood of low-cost Chinese imports and to force a reshoring of the entire supply chain back onto American soil. The political rhetoric was powerful, resonating with manufacturing communities hollowed out by decades of globalization. It was a promise to rebuild American industrial might, one battery, one car, one job at a time. The policy was designed to make any vehicle assembled with foreign-sourced critical minerals, especially those processed outside of North America, significantly more expensive for the American consumer. From a purely political standpoint, the logic is very easy to sell. You say, we're stopping China, and we're bringing jobs home. It's a potent message. The policy aims to create a closed-loop system where American raw materials are processed in American factories to build American cars. The problem is, that system doesn't exist yet. The U.S. simply does not have the domestic capacity to mine and refine all the critical minerals it needs, especially nickel. For that, it has historically relied on its most stable, most predictable partner, Canada. The architects of the tariff saw this dependency not as a strength, but as a loophole. In their view, while Canadian nickel ore was acceptable, the value-added processing and refining could and should be done in the U.S. The tariff was a cudgel intended to force that shift. The assumption was that Canada, with its economy so deeply intertwined with the U.S., would have no choice but to comply. The U.S. market, they believed, was simply too big to lose. Natural Resources Canada data shows that in 2023, the United States accounted for nearly half of Canada's $3.2 billion in nickel exports. Official trade statistics from sources like the UN Comtrade database confirm the U.S. imported over $1 billion worth of nickel from its northern neighbor in the first part of 2024 alone. With numbers like that, Washington bet that Ottawa would eventually bend the knee. It was a high-stakes gamble, assuming the historic partnership was strong enough to withstand a direct economic punch. They fundamentally miscalculated the Canadian response, viewing the relationship as a hierarchy rather than a partnership. The message was clear: fall in line or be treated like any other foreign competitor. It was a move that ignored decades of integrated industrial policy and underestimated the growing frustration north of the border. Washington had just thrown a rock at a hornet's nest. The reaction from Ottawa was swift and uncharacteristically fierce. For years, Canada had absorbed economic blows from its largest trading partner, often opting for quiet diplomacy over public confrontation. This time was different. The tariff was seen not as a legitimate trade tool, but as an act of economic aggression, a betrayal of the very continental partnership the U.S. claimed it wanted to strengthen. The Canadian government immediately condemned the move as a violation of free trade principles that would harm workers and consumers on both sides of the border. But words were just the beginning. The Canadian response was a calculated, multi-pronged counter-assault designed to inflict targeted pain and demonstrate that Canada was not a passive resource colony, but a sovereign economic power with options. The U.S. needs to be very careful here. We are the largest source of nickel to the United States. If they make our nickel more expensive, we can ship our nickel to Europe or Asia just as easily. The demand is global, and we will sell to whoever values it most. This wasn't just corporate posturing, it was a declaration of independence. Behind the scenes, the Canadian government began crafting its own set of retaliatory measures. Leaks to the press spoke of a potential 15% export tax specifically targeting nickel destined for the U.S., a move designed to directly offset the American tariff and make the cost prohibitive for U.S. buyers. More strategically, Ottawa announced a new carbon pricing mechanism for heavy industry, effectively a green tariff that would reward domestic processing and penalize carbon-intensive supply chains, a subtle but direct jab at U.S. facilities that might rely on less stringent environmental standards. To back this up, the government unveiled a $257 million fund to help Canadian mining companies retool and divert their exports away from the U.S. and towards new markets in the European Union and Asia, particularly South Korea and Japan, who were desperate to secure non-Chinese sources for their own burgeoning EV industries. As analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies highlights, Canada is the single largest supplier of nickel to the U.S. The threat of redirecting this flow was not empty. While official data on this market reorientation is still emerging, the intent was clear. As one Ontario provincial leader bluntly stated in a heated debate, echoing threats from past disputes, "If they want to play hardball, we can discuss everything from agricultural imports to the energy pipelines they depend on." The message from Canada was unequivocal. You cannot take our resources for granted. If the U.S. wants to build a fortress, Canada will build bridges to everywhere else. And so, the two allies find themselves locked in a dangerous standoff. A game of economic chicken played out across a 5,000-mile border. The United States, determined to onshore its supply chain, has discovered its primary partner is unwilling to be a pawn in that strategy. An analysis by Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy warned this exact scenario would severely damage the North American supply chain, as Canada is not an easily replaceable partner for critical minerals. American EV manufacturers now face a paralyzing dilemma: absorb the higher costs and become uncompetitive, or scramble to find new, less reliable sources of nickel, potentially delaying production targets for years. Meanwhile, Canada, while projecting strength, faces its own precarious reality. The U.S. remains its largest and most convenient market. Pivoting an entire industry towards new continents is a monumental and costly undertaking, fraught with logistical risks. The retaliatory measures, while strategically sound, threaten jobs and investment in the very communities they are meant to protect. Both nations are now caught in a trap of their own making, where any move to escalate risks catastrophic economic self-harm yet backing down would be a politically devastating admission of defeat. The integrated supply chain, once a source of mutual prosperity, has become a shared vulnerability. For over a century, the city of Sudbury, Ontario, wasn't just built on nickel, it was built by nickel. Generations of families have descended into the earth here, pulling the vital metal from the Canadian shield. This work has funded schools, hospitals, and a rugged, proud way of life. The predictable, steady demand from American industry, just a few hundred miles south, was the bedrock of this community's prosperity. Now, that bedrock is fracturing, and the tremors are being felt everywhere. Consider a mid-sized mining services company in the region. Let's call them Northern Shield Logistics. For 30 years, their business model was simple and profitable. They supplied specialized equipment and transportation services for nickel ore and processed materials heading directly to U.S. smelters and factories. Their entire operation, from the type of trucks they bought to the customs brokers they employed, was optimized for cross-border trade. The uncertainty is the killer. One day you have a contract, the next day your U.S. buyer calls and says, "We have to put everything on hold." A 15 or 25% tariff? That doesn't just eat your profit margin, it erases it entirely. So we have trucks sitting idle, we have orders for new equipment canceled, and for every job on the front line in the mine, there are 3 or 4 support jobs like ours in the community that are now at risk. We're being told to look for new markets in Europe or Asia. That's a great long-term goal, but that doesn't help me make payroll next Friday. This story is repeated across the Canadian resource sector. While Canada projects confidence on the world stage, the on-the-ground reality is one of anxiety. The country exported approximately $3.2 billion in nickel in 2023, with the U.S. market historically accounting for up to half of that volume, over $1 billion in recent figures. The immediate disruption is immense. The government's pivot fund is a lifeline, but reorienting global supply chains takes years, not months. It requires building new relationships, navigating different regulatory systems, and establishing complex new logistics. For the communities built on the promise of a stable continental partnership, the cost of this trade war isn't measured in policy papers or diplomatic cables, but in canceled shifts, for sale signs, and a deep, unsettling fear that the foundation of their economic lives has been permanently eroded. This is not a one-sided story. Thousands of miles away from the mines of Sudbury, the consequences of this economic decoupling are landing with a thud on the factory floors of the American industrial heartland. Take a company like Pioneer Battery Solutions, a fictional but representative example of a next-generation U.S. enterprise. They've invested billions in a new facility, lured by government incentives from the Inflation Reduction Act, all designed to build an American EV battery champion. Their business plan, their production timelines, and their cost projections were all based on one critical, now broken assumption: a stable, affordable supply of high-grade Class 1 nickel from Canada. As the primary source of nickel for the U.S., Canada's role was not just important, it was foundational. American automakers and battery producers are in a terrible bind. They can't just flip a switch and get their nickel from somewhere else. Indonesia or the Philippines might have nickel, but it's often a different grade, requiring different, more carbon-intensive processing. Furthermore, their supply chains are often dominated by Chinese companies, which is the very thing U.S. policy is trying to avoid. So they're stuck. They can try to absorb the cost of the tariff and the Canadian countermeasures, which makes their final product more expensive and less competitive against foreign imports. Or they can face production slowdowns and delays, which means breaking promises to the market, to investors, and to the American workers they just hired. The blowback extends directly to the American consumer. The dream of an affordable, American-made electric vehicle recedes with every percentage point added to the cost of its most expensive component, the battery. A projected price tag of $35,000 for a family EV creeps up to $40,000, then $45,000, pushing it out of reach for millions. The very policy intended to protect American industry ends up harming its competitiveness and slowing the green energy transition it was meant to accelerate. The analysis from Columbia's Energy Policy Center was prescient. Severing the integrated North American supply chain without a viable domestic alternative creates a vacuum. It's a classic case of unintended consequences, where a move to punish a perceived dependency only serves to reveal how deeply codependent the two nations truly are. The cost of this dispute is being paid by miners in Ontario and by factory workers and car buyers in Michigan and Tennessee.